The Bet. The Manhattan Lounge, a beacon of opulence nestled in the heart of the city, hummed with the sounds of quiet conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses. High above, the chandeliers sparkled like jewels, casting their golden light over the powerful elite who gathered in this sanctuary of wealth. Conversations flowed easily here, centered on mergers, acquisitions, and global markets. The room was alive with the scent of expensive cigars, the rich warmth of whiskey, and the subtle tension that always seemed to accompany the world's most powerful individuals. At the center of it all, sitting with an air of effortless command, was Garrett Lawson. He had always been the man who defined success. A name that was synonymous with financial conquest, he had turned even the most modest acquisitions into towering empires. His influence was unquestioned, his power nearly absolute, and his wealth immeasurable. At 42, he had achieved everything one could hope for: status, respect, and an almost godlike control over the financial world. Garrett's life was one of precision, calculated moves, and ruthless ambition. In business, he never lost, never faltered. His tailored suits and sharp features, accented by an almost predatory confidence, made him a commanding figure wherever he went. His carefully curated world was one of luxury and domination, a far cry from the struggles of ordinary men. He was above it all, or so he thought. But tonight, something felt different. Seated across from him was Theodore Caldwell, an old friend and occasional rival, whose sharp wit was matched only by his tendency to provoke. Theodore had been the one who had invited him to the lounge, to discuss a new venture, but it quickly became apparent that this evening was not going to be about business. Theodore had always been the one to test boundaries, to challenge the limits of Garrett's comfort. It was part of their dynamic, this strange push-pull of respect and rivalry. But tonight, Theodore wasn't here to talk about business. The older man, leaning back in his plush leather chair, regarded Garrett with a glint of mischief in his eyes. The kind of mischief that made Garrett uneasy, though he would never admit it. "You've done it all, Garrett," Theodore said, swirling his drink thoughtfully. "Built an empire, crushed your competitors, made billions. What's next? What's left for someone like you?" Garrett, never one to shy away from an intellectual challenge, met his friend's gaze. "I don't do this for accolades, Theodore. I do it to win. To prove that I can dominate whatever I set my sights on. I've built a life that's invincible, and I'm not interested in anything that doesn't advance my position." Theodore smiled, as though he had been waiting for this moment. His voice lowered slightly, taking on a teasing tone. "Is that so? Because I think you've conquered the wrong things. You've built your empire on the backs of others, but what about something that's truly difficult? Something that would make you question your assumptions?" Garrett's brow furrowed. "What are you getting at?" Theodore leaned in closer, his eyes gleaming with a challenge. "I bet you can't marry a woman who is as far removed from your world as possible. A woman who has nothing, no money, no status, no security. And here's the kicker. She's a mother of twins. Homeless, struggling. Think of it as a true test of character. You, the great Garrett Lawson, reduced to something more human." A silence settled between them as Garrett processed the words. His initial reaction was disbelief. He could marry anyone he wanted. Any socialite, any celebrity, any heiress would fall at his feet. The idea of marrying someone who had nothing, a woman with no power, no wealth, no social standing, was absurd. But the way Theodore's eyes glinted with mischief made something inside him stir. "You think I can't do it?" Garrett said, his voice growing colder, but his ego already on the rise. "You think I can't persuade a woman, any woman, to marry me? I could have any woman I want." Theodore chuckled softly. "I'm not talking about just convincing her to marry you. I'm talking about something deeper. Can you truly connect with someone who has absolutely nothing? Can you make a woman like that believe in you, trust you, marry you? It's not about money, Garrett. It's about something much more difficult, real human connection. You think you've mastered everything, but can you master this? Garrett's pride flared. This was a challenge like no other. It wasn't about power or business acumen. It wasn't about conquering markets or dominating boardrooms. It was about something far more complex, the heart. A challenge of persuasion, yes, but also one of character. Could he take someone who had suffered unimaginable hardships, someone who had lived in a world where power and money meant nothing, and convince her to marry him? Fine, Garrett said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. I'll do it. You'll see. I'll marry her, and I'll have her fall in love with me. You'll pay up when I'm done. Theodore grinned, leaning back in his seat, clearly pleased. We'll see. You have a month. 1 month to make this happen. If you succeed, $1 million is yours. But if you fail, well, let's just say I'll have a good laugh. The terms were set, and Garrett, filled with a rare sense of anticipation, stood up from the booth. He hadn't felt this excited about something in years. The game had changed, and it was about to become far more personal. But as he walked away from the lounge that night, his mind was already turning. He wasn't just going to marry any homeless woman. He was going to find someone extraordinary. Someone with potential. Someone who, in his mind, deserved to be taken out of the gutter and placed into the lap of luxury. This wasn't just about winning a bet. It was about proving something to himself. This challenge would push him in ways he had never imagined. Little did Garrett know, this seemingly insignificant bet would unravel his carefully constructed world in ways that would leave him questioning everything he had ever known about success, love, and what truly mattered. Meeting Emily. The days after the bet were a blur of preparations for Garrett Lawson. What had seemed like a simple challenge, a way to prove his ability to win any game, to control any outcome, was rapidly transforming into something that gnawed at his confidence. It wasn't the difficulty of the task, nor the challenge of convincing a homeless woman to marry him. It was the realization that this was unlike anything he had ever done before. He wasn't just negotiating business deals or outsmarting rivals in a high-stakes game. This was about reaching into a world he had never truly understood, about dealing with a life that could not be dictated by contracts or stock market trends. Garrett threw himself into the search, his usual methodical approach now directed at finding the right woman. He was determined to win the bet, but his pride refused to let him simply pick any woman off the streets. He had to find someone remarkable, someone who could still be shaped, someone with the potential for a life far beyond the one they were currently living. He enlisted the help of his private investigators and staff to comb through the city's shelters, soup kitchens, and charity organizations. Every day, they brought him profiles, stories of struggling mothers, families torn apart by tragedy, people trying to survive in a system that had forgotten them. But none of them seemed to match the image in Garrett's mind. None had the fire he was searching for. One night, after another exhausting round of interviews, Garrett found himself wandering the streets of Manhattan, lost in thought. The neon lights of the city flashed overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch for miles. He passed through the usual areas where the homeless gathered, but tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with anticipation, and yet, there was a heaviness that he couldn't shake. It was then that he saw her. She was sitting on the steps of a small building near a subway entrance, her twin babies in her lap, wrapped in ragged blankets. The woman was holding them tenderly, her eyes distant but protective, as if she was watching over them against the cruel world around her. Her face was tired, hollowed by sleepless nights and unspoken pain, but there was something in her posture, in the way she shielded her children, that caught his attention. There was strength in her, a quiet kind of resilience that stood out in stark contrast to the brokenness of the world around her. Garrett stopped for a moment, his instincts kicking in. This wasn't just another homeless woman. This was someone who had fought to survive, someone who had refused to be crushed by her circumstances. He watched her for a few seconds, trying to determine whether she was the one. The challenge flashed in his mind, and for a moment, he almost forgot the bet entirely. He didn't need just any woman. He needed her. Someone who might just surprise him, someone who would make this challenge worth it. Steeling himself, Garrett approached, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he closed the distance between them. The woman glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly as if measuring him in an instant. It wasn't the typical look of surprise or wonder that he was used to when women saw him, it was something different. Something sharp. She wasn't fooled by his expensive suit or the arrogant air that clung to him. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling," she said flatly, her voice raw but steady. The directness of her response startled him, and for a split second, he didn't know how to react. "I'm not selling anything," Garrett replied, his voice cool. "I'm just trying to offer a better life." She didn't flinch. "A better life? You don't get to offer me a better life, not like this. What makes you think I want anything from you?" Garrett felt the sting of her words, but it only spurred him on. He'd faced far worse insults in his career, from rivals and competitors who wanted to tear him down. But here, in front of this woman, the rules of his world didn't apply. He had to be careful. He had to win her over, but it wouldn't be easy. "I don't want to be your savior," he said, leaning slightly forward. "But I think you're someone who deserves more. You have potential. A future. And I can offer that." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes unreadable. Then, without a word, she shifted the babies in her arms and stood up, brushing her clothes off as she adjusted the worn fabric. "You don't know anything about me. About my life. You don't get to decide what I deserve." Garrett's frustration bubbled up, but he forced himself to keep his composure. He had come this far, he couldn't back down now. He knew how to read people, how to make them see things his way, and this woman was no different. "I don't need to know everything about you," he said, his voice softening. "I just need you to see that there's an opportunity for you. For your children. You could have a life beyond the streets, beyond this." The woman didn't respond immediately. She seemed to contemplate his words, her gaze flicking between him and the children. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You really think you can change my life? You think you can fix me?" Her voice cracked slightly, and for a brief moment, Garrett saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "I don't think I can fix you," he replied, a bit more earnestly now. "I think you've already fixed yourself. I just think I can offer you a way to rebuild. Something better. Something more." She was quiet again, and for a moment, Garrett thought she might turn him down. He had expected resistance, but this felt different. There was a deep wariness in her, something that told him she wasn't someone who trusted easily, not even those with all the power in the world. She had fought too many battles just to survive. She wasn't about to fall for empty promises. Then, with a sigh, she spoke again, this time with an edge of resignation. "Fine. I'll listen. But make it quick. I don't have all night." That was all Garrett needed. He had her attention now. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but something in him, something beyond the bet, told him that this woman, Emily, was more than just a challenge. She was real. She was someone who could shift everything he thought he knew about himself. They stood there, on the edge of a crumbling sidewalk, the city's noise swirling around them like a distant hum. For the first time in his life, Garrett felt like he was about to embark on something that wasn't about control, power, or victory. It was about something much harder to define. Something that would make him question everything. The marriage. The days that followed were filled with the kind of tension that Garrett Lawson had never experienced before. Every meeting with Emily, every conversation, seemed to strip away the layers of his carefully constructed world. He had expected this challenge to be a simple, cold transaction. A bet. Something he could win with little effort. But Emily was proving to be far more complicated than he had anticipated. There was a depth to her, an emotional resistance, that couldn't be overcome with his usual methods of persuasion. And as the days stretched into weeks, Garrett found himself questioning whether this game was as simple as he had imagined. The moment they left the shelter that first evening, something about Emily's quiet strength had unsettled him. She wasn't like the women he was used to, polished, eager to climb higher in the social ladder. Emily didn't care about status. She didn't want money or luxury. She was a mother first, a survivor who had learned to live without the comforts of a life he could barely comprehend. It wasn't just her children that defined her. Emily had a core of resilience that had been shaped by the rawest aspects of life, the kind Garrett had never had to face. He quickly realized that in all his years of conquering empires, this was one territory he didn't know how to navigate. The arrangement was simple enough. Garrett would provide Emily with the financial means to start over, offer her a new life with a home, security, and comfort. He would take care of her twins, too, ensuring that they had everything they needed. In return, she would marry him. They would sign the papers, live under the same roof, and he would win the bet. The agreement was pragmatic on the surface, but it was clear to him now that there was no winning when it came to the complexities of human emotions. Yet, Emily had agreed. That was the part that still confused him. Why would she say yes? What did she stand to gain from this arrangement? Was it the money? The stability? Or was there something deeper in her, something he hadn't yet unlocked? In the days that followed, Garrett found himself spending more time with Emily than he had originally planned. Their interactions had started as business meetings, but slowly they began to slip into a more personal territory. He'd take her to lunch, sit with her in her new apartment, a modest place, not lavish by his standards, but far more comfortable than the streets. It wasn't the luxury he was used to, but Emily seemed to be at ease in it. She had a way of making it feel like a home. He would sit on the couch while she prepared simple meals for her children, making small talk, trying to understand her life. Emily would talk sparingly, often avoiding the subject of the past, but every now and then, when the silence was heavy enough, she would offer small glimpses into the woman she had been before her world had been shattered. "I used to have a life," she said one evening, after the twins had fallen asleep. "A normal life. I wasn't always on the streets, you know. I had a husband, a house. Things were different. I didn't think I'd end up here." Garrett had heard stories like this before, of lives turned upside down by betrayal, by misfortune. But something about Emily's voice, the way she said it, made the words resonate with a weight he hadn't expected. This wasn't a story about poverty. It was a story about survival, about the tenacity of a woman who had lost everything and still refused to give in. "What happened?" he asked, his voice almost hesitant. He wasn't used to asking people about their pasts. People usually came to him with a need, something that could be fixed, something he could control. But Emily wasn't like that. She looked at him, her eyes tired but still sharp. "He left," she said simply, her gaze shifting away. "He left me when things got hard. Took everything with him. The house, the car, the savings. I was left with nothing but the twins. And he doesn't even know them." Garrett didn't know how to respond. The idea of losing everything in an instant was foreign to him. He had always been in control of his life, always made sure that everything was positioned exactly where it needed to be. Failure was a concept he couldn't relate to. But Emily's life wasn't defined by success or failure. It was defined by perseverance. "Why didn't you fight back?" he asked, trying to understand. "Why didn't you take him to court? Fight for your kids?" "I did," she replied quietly. "But when you don't have the resources, when you don't have money, no one listens. You get lost in the system. No one cares. I had no choice but to start over. And starting over wasn't easy. Her words hung in the air, thick with emotion. For the first time, Garrett felt like he was in the presence of someone who had truly been tested by life. It wasn't a test of business acumen or intellect. It was a test of spirit. Of survival. And Emily had passed it, not without scars, but with a kind of quiet strength that Garrett couldn't help but admire. Their marriage ceremony came quickly after that, a simple affair held in a small, private room at the city hall. There were no frills, no white dress, no grand celebration. It was nothing like the lavish weddings Garrett had been to in the past, the ones that were more about the spectacle than the vows. Emily wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. She looked tired, yes, but there was something beautiful about her, something real. Garrett, in his usual perfectly tailored suit, stood beside her, his posture rigid as he prepared for the ceremony. It was just a formality, a signature, a win. The judge spoke, and as the words were exchanged, Garrett couldn't help but notice that Emily wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at anyone. Her gaze was distant, as if she was somewhere else entirely. He couldn't tell if it was relief, resignation, or something else. He'd seen her give a lot of things up in her life, her home, her family, her dignity. But this was different. When the ceremony ended, and they were handed the certificate, Emily glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "We're married now," she said quietly. "But don't expect anything more than that." Garrett nodded, a knot forming in his stomach. He had won the bet, yes. But something in the air felt unsettled. He had imagined that this would be the point where everything clicked into place, where he could finally mark the challenge as complete. But Emily had made it clear, this wasn't just a game to her. This wasn't something she had done lightly. She wasn't a pawn in his game, and she wasn't going to be manipulated. She turned to leave, and for the first time since meeting her, Garrett felt something stir inside him. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't pride. It was something else. Something he couldn't name, but something that made him feel uncertain. This wasn't the woman he had imagined when he had accepted the bet. Emily wasn't a problem to be solved. She wasn't a person to be controlled. She was a force all her own, one that demanded respect, not manipulation. And for the first time in his life, Garrett realized that he had no idea what to do next. The truth revealed. The days after the wedding passed by with a strange quietness that neither Garrett nor Emily could explain. It wasn't the usual bustle of a new marriage, no excitement, no plans, no discussions about the future. Instead, there was a calm distance that hovered between them, a mutual understanding that they were living together, but not really together in any meaningful sense. For Garrett, life continued as usual. He threw himself back into the high-paced world of finance, attending meetings, closing deals, and maintaining his empire. But something had shifted. No matter how hard he tried to distract himself with work, he found his mind drifting back to Emily, to the way she had looked at him during their wedding, her eyes not full of joy, but of something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. Emily, on the other hand, settled into her new life with an unnerving grace. She adjusted to her apartment in the luxury building Garrett had secured for her, despite the overwhelming difference in the world she had known and the one she was now stepping into. She spent most of her days caring for her twins, going to the park with them, or doing the mundane, practical things that all mothers did. There was no fanfare, no special gratitude, no overwhelming joy in the material comforts that surrounded her. She had learned long ago that security was fragile, that nothing in life was guaranteed. And though she appreciated the stability Garrett offered, there was something in her that resisted the idea of this new life, like it was too good to be true, like it was just another chapter in a story that would end in disappointment. It was late one evening, as the golden light of dusk filtered through the large windows of their apartment, that Garrett noticed something strange. Emily had been distant, yes, but tonight, she seemed especially quiet. She sat at the kitchen table, her eyes lost in thought as she watched the twins play with a set of blocks on the floor. Her mind appeared to be somewhere far away, and for a moment, Garrett wondered if she had been thinking about her past. Perhaps it was the weight of the new life she was living, or perhaps, something had happened that she hadn't shared with him. Without thinking, Garrett crossed the room and sat down across from her. His voice was casual at first, but his eyes studied her with a new intensity. "You've been quiet lately," he said, trying to sound nonchalant, as if this was just another ordinary evening. Emily didn't look up right away. She let the silence linger between them before finally meeting his gaze. There was something in her eyes, something raw, like an unspoken sorrow that she had buried deep within. She set the coffee mug down slowly and folded her hands in front of her, as if preparing herself for something difficult. "There's something I haven't told you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett's interest peaked, and his usual stoic exterior cracked just a bit. "What is it?" Emily's lips pressed together, and for a moment, she seemed to hesitate. "You don't really know me, Garrett. Not the real me." He nodded. "I don't pretend to know everything about you. We barely know each other." She looked at him then, and the vulnerability in her gaze surprised him. It was as if she had been holding something back, something that had weighed on her heart for years, and only now, after they were married, did she feel ready to share it. "There's a reason I ended up on the streets. A reason I couldn't keep going with my old life." Garrett felt a strange sense of unease ripple through him. He had assumed that Emily's troubles had been mostly financial, that her ex-husband had left her destitute, and she had simply been forced to survive however she could. But as she continued speaking, he realized that her story was far more complicated than he had thought. "My ex-husband," Emily began, her voice barely audible now, "he didn't just leave me. He left because of something he did. Something that changed everything for me." Garrett leaned forward, instinctively sensing the gravity of her words. "What do you mean? What happened?" Emily took a long breath, as if gathering the strength to speak the truth. "Before everything fell apart, my husband had been involved in a deal with a man in your world. A deal that went wrong. He lied to the wrong people, made promises that he couldn't keep. And it cost us everything. Our house, our savings, our future. But it wasn't just the money. It was what he did afterward. He disappeared. He didn't even try to make things right. He left me with 2 children and nothing to my name, with nothing but a pile of broken promises." Garrett's mind began to race. He had known that Emily's past involved hardship, but this revelation hit too close to home. It was only when she continued that he realized the full scope of what she was saying. "The man my ex-husband betrayed was someone you know. Someone you've worked with," Emily said, her eyes now locked on his. "It was David Montgomery." The name hit Garrett like a punch to the gut. David Montgomery. A name from his past, someone he had worked with, someone who had been a business associate during a particularly complicated deal years ago. A man who had a reputation for being ruthless, someone who didn't forgive easily. David Montgomery. Garrett repeated the name under his breath, trying to process the information. His mind flashed back to that deal, to the backroom negotiations, to the way things had turned sour when Montgomery's company had started pulling out. Garrett had never known the full extent of what had happened, only that it had ended in disaster for some, and in victory for others. But hearing Emily's words now, it all made sense. The betrayal, the fallout. "But why didn't you tell me this before?" Garrett asked, struggling to reconcile the pieces of the puzzle. "Why didn't you say anything?" Emily's expression softened, but there was still a guarded look in her eyes. "I didn't want you to see me as just another victim. I didn't want to use your connections to get back at anyone. And I didn't want you to think I was only here because of what I could get from you." Garrett was silent for a long moment. His mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. Emily's past, her suffering, her reasons for being here, it all made him question everything. But what struck him the most was the realization that Emily had never seen him as a source of salvation. She had never been interested in his money, his status, or the security he could offer. She had agreed to marry him because, for her, survival wasn't about luxury. It was about providing for her children, making sure they didn't suffer the way she had. Garrett had always prided himself on his ability to control everything, to manipulate every situation to his advantage. But here, with Emily, he realized he was out of his depth. He had underestimated her in every way possible. She was not the naive, grateful woman he had imagined. She was strong, complex, and not easily manipulated. But even as that realization set in, a different kind of awareness settled in his chest. It wasn't just that he was starting to respect Emily more, it was that he was beginning to care. And that, more than anything, terrified him. "I'm sorry," Garrett said quietly, his voice heavy with an emotion he wasn't used to expressing. "I didn't know. I had no idea." Emily shook her head. "It's not your fault. It's just, the truth. It's been buried for so long. I just needed you to know." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Neither of them knew where this new understanding would lead them. But one thing was clear, this marriage, this arrangement, was no longer just about a bet. It had become something far more complicated, far more real than either of them had anticipated. And as Garrett looked at Emily, he realized that the woman who had once seemed like a mere challenge was now someone he could never fully control. In a way, that scared him more than any business deal he had ever made. The turning point. The weeks following Emily's revelation were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and unexpected realizations for Garrett. The comfortable world he had built, one where money and control were the ultimate forces, was starting to crumble in ways he had never anticipated. Emily had shattered the preconceived notions he had about both her and himself. She was no longer just the woman in the bet, she was someone with a past, with real, unyielding strength, and someone who had survived more than he ever could have imagined. For Garrett, the hardest part was that Emily didn't need his help. She didn't need his wealth, nor did she want his pity. She had shown him that survival wasn't just about the luxuries he could offer, it was about resilience, determination, and a drive to rise above adversity. While Garrett had spent years building an empire based on calculated risks and profits, Emily had spent her life navigating the unpredictable chaos of poverty, heartache, and betrayal. And yet, she still stood strong, fiercely protective of her children and determined to protect them from the world that had torn her apart. The strain between them was palpable. Although they continued to share a roof, the distance between them seemed to grow wider every day. Emily was a mother first and foremost, and she made no secret of her focus on providing for her children, often retreating into her role as a parent while avoiding the complexities of their marriage. She had done what she had to do for survival, but there was no illusion in her eyes anymore about her relationship with Garrett. He was not the knight in shining armor that Hollywood stories promised. He wasn't her savior. He was just another person in her life, one who had offered her a way out of homelessness, but not necessarily a way into her heart. For the first time, Garrett found himself in a position where he couldn't control the outcome. The game was no longer his to win. The rules were shifting, and his empire of influence, honed over decades, seemed insignificant compared to the depth of Emily's struggles and the strength of her resolve. One evening, after the twins had gone to bed, Garrett decided to confront Emily. There had been too many unspoken words, too many moments of silence that weighed heavily between them. He could feel it, she was pulling away, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could live in this awkward limbo. It was time to break through, to try and understand the woman he had married, not as a challenge, but as a person. He found her sitting on the balcony of their apartment, staring out over the city skyline, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights below. The air was crisp, the wind tugging at her hair, and for a moment, she looked completely alone, detached from everything around her. Garrett hesitated for a brief moment before stepping forward. "You've been distant lately," he said, his voice carefully neutral, not wanting to sound accusatory, but needing to address the tension. "I don't know what's going on in your head, Emily. But I need you to talk to me. This isn't just about the bet anymore. It's about us. About what we're doing here." She turned her head slightly, but didn't meet his eyes. "What we're doing here," she repeated, almost softly. "We're living, Garrett. That's what we're doing here. You're doing what you've always done. You're making money, controlling things, and I'm doing what I've always done, taking care of my children, surviving. That's it." Garrett's jaw clenched. "Is that all this is to you? Just survival?" Emily turned to face him then, and her gaze was intense, a mixture of frustration and something else, something deeper that he couldn't place. "What do you want me to say, Garrett? That I'm grateful for the fancy apartment, the clothes, the food on the table? That I feel indebted to you? Well, I don't. I didn't ask for this life. You're right that we're both just living, but we're living in two completely different worlds, and that's never going to change." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had known they came from a place of hurt, but hearing them spoken aloud, with such conviction, made something inside him crack. Emily had never once asked for his wealth. She had never once hinted at wanting anything from him beyond stability for her children. And yet, here he was, trying to fit her into a life she didn't want. Trying to make her into something she wasn't, all because of a bet he had thought was meaningless. "Then what do you want, Emily?" he asked, his voice more strained now, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make you see that I'm not just trying to buy you. I'm trying to understand you. I'm trying to—" "Trying to what?" she interrupted, shaking her head as though the idea itself was laughable. "Trying to understand me? You don't understand anything about me, Garrett. You think that throwing money at a problem solves it. But it doesn't. It never has. You can't buy your way into my life. You can't fix the things that are broken by throwing a checkbook at them." Garrett's chest tightened. His usual tactics weren't working. Nothing he had ever relied on, money, influence, charm, had any power here. Emily's walls were too high, too solid, built over years of pain, betrayal, and survival. His empire of control didn't apply to her. And the realization stung more than anything else he had ever faced. Emily stood up, taking a deep breath as if preparing to say something even more difficult. "Look, Garrett," she said softly, "I didn't marry you because I thought you were going to save me. I married you because I thought it would give my children a better chance. A better life than the one I had. But it's not just about the apartment. Or the money. It's about respect. And you don't respect me." The words cut through him like a blade. She was right. He hadn't respected her, not in the way she needed. He had seen her as a challenge to win, a puzzle to solve. He had thought that his power, his wealth, could fix everything. But in doing so, he had completely missed the person standing in front of him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never meant to disrespect you. I've been so focused on winning this bet that I lost sight of what really matters. I lost sight of you. Of us." Emily's eyes softened slightly, but the hardness was still there. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. "I don't need you to apologize, Garrett. I just need you to understand that I'm not some prize for you to claim. I'm a person. And I've been through hell to get here. I don't need your pity, and I don't need your charity. I just need you to see me for who I am." Garrett didn't know how to respond. He had thought he was doing the right thing, offering her a chance at a life she hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. But in doing so, he had pushed her further away. Emily had never been the woman he imagined. She wasn't someone to be controlled or manipulated. She was someone to be respected. Someone with her own strength, her own identity. As the silence stretched between them, Garrett realized that this wasn't about the bet. It was about a woman who had fought for everything she had, and who had nothing left to give except the truth. And if Garrett wanted any chance of truly understanding her, he would have to step back and reevaluate everything, his approach, his assumptions, and perhaps most importantly, his own motivations. "Tell me what I can do," Garrett said, his voice barely above a whisper, "to prove that I'm not here to control you. Tell me what you need. I want to make things right." Emily stood there for a long time, her gaze never leaving his, before she finally spoke. "Just be real with me, Garrett. That's all I need. Just be real." It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. For the first time in their relationship, Garrett felt like they were standing on equal ground. The game had shifted. There were no more bets. There was only the truth, and the rawness of it both terrified and invigorated him. As he watched Emily walk back into the apartment, his heart heavy with the weight of everything unsaid, Garrett realized that the true challenge wasn't winning a bet. It was understanding the woman he had married and discovering what it meant to truly be with someone, not just alongside them. The ultimate discovery. The days that followed the conversation on the balcony were a turning point for Garrett and Emily. Neither of them knew what to expect next. There was no sudden shift, no dramatic revelation. Instead, they began a slow, uneasy process of understanding, of peeling back the layers that had built up between them. Each day felt like a quiet negotiation, a delicate dance of trust and vulnerability, something neither of them had ever truly experienced before. For Garrett, the shift was internal. He had spent years focusing on the mechanics of control, his empire, his wealth, his influence. He was the one who made decisions, who dictated outcomes. But with Emily, he had come to realize that control was the last thing she needed. What she required was respect, understanding, and time. Time he hadn't considered to give before, time he had assumed was only for the taking. It was a Friday evening when the breakthrough happened. The sun had dipped below the skyline, casting a soft amber glow across the apartment, and the world outside seemed to hum with the energy of the city. Inside, Emily was sitting on the couch, the twins sprawled out on the floor, their toys scattered in every direction. Garrett had been working from home that day, seated at his desk, reviewing reports, but there was a noticeable absence of the usual tension in the air. This was the first evening in weeks that felt like something resembling peace. Emily's posture had changed subtly. She wasn't just a mother anymore, she was a person again, too. A woman with her own desires, her own thoughts, her own future, not just the person who had been thrust into a marriage for the sake of survival. As Garrett closed his laptop and set it aside, his gaze shifted to her. It had become something of a routine now. He would watch her in quiet moments, wondering what she was thinking, wondering if she ever saw him as more than just the man who had given her an escape from poverty. And tonight, he finally found the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at him for weeks. "Emily," he began, his voice steady, but with an underlying uncertainty, "what happens next?" She looked up, meeting his gaze, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the question hanging between them. "I don't know," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a sadness that surprised him. "I don't know where this goes. I don't even know where I go from here." It wasn't the answer he had expected, but it was the one that made the most sense. The journey they were on together wasn't linear, it wasn't a simple path from one step to the next. There was no clear endgame, no neat resolution waiting at the finish line. There was only the reality of now, of the present, and the challenge of figuring out how to exist together when their worlds were so different. "What do you need from me?" Garrett asked, his voice quieter now. It was a question he had never asked anyone before, not with sincerity, not in a way that mattered. Emily looked at him for a long moment, her gaze softening. The walls she had built around herself were still there, but now they were porous, open to something new. "I need you to be here, Garrett," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I need you to stop trying to fix everything and just be with me. Be present. I need to know that you're not just doing this because it's what you think I need. I need you to be real. To be honest with me. That's all." It was simple. And yet it felt like the most complicated request anyone had ever made of him. To just be with her. To be present in a way that wasn't about his power, his wealth, or his ability to control. It was about something deeper, something quieter, human connection. Something that Garrett had spent his whole life running from because it required vulnerability, the one thing he had never been willing to offer. For the first time, Garrett felt the full weight of Emily's words. They weren't just a plea for honesty, they were a revelation. She wasn't asking for him to solve her problems. She wasn't asking for him to change the world. She was asking for him to change himself, to stop being the man who dictated everything and to become someone who could stand beside her, not above her. Garrett leaned forward, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than he had ever allowed it to be. "I've spent so long thinking I could control everything. That everything could be fixed with a plan, with money, with power. But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to fix us." Emily didn't respond immediately. She didn't offer empty reassurances or dismiss his fears. Instead, she just sat there, her eyes locked on his, understanding in them. It was the kind of understanding that made Garrett feel exposed, but not judged. There was no scorn in her gaze, only the acceptance of a person who had been broken, rebuilt, and learned to live with the cracks. "I don't need you to fix anything, Garrett," she said, her voice steady but gentle. "I just need you to show up. To be here. That's all." It wasn't the grand gesture he had expected, the moment where everything clicked into place. But it was something deeper, something more lasting. It was a request for realness, for presence, for something that couldn't be bought or manipulated. It was about being human, not just a figure in a story that had already been written. And in that moment, Garrett realized that this wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't about winning. This was about learning. About growing. About tearing down the walls he had spent a lifetime building, and allowing himself to truly see the person sitting across from him, not as an object of conquest, not as a means to an end, but as an equal. The next few weeks were not easy. The path forward wasn't clear, and there were still moments when Garrett would fall back on old habits, trying to fix things, trying to control outcomes, but each time, Emily would gently pull him back, reminding him that this wasn't about fixing. It was about being present. They began to share more, stories of their pasts, the things that shaped them, the ways in which they had both been hurt, and the ways they had both learned to survive. There were no grand proclamations, no dramatic shifts. But there was a quiet understanding, a slow, steady growth between them that neither of them had anticipated. Garrett still didn't have all the answers. He still didn't know exactly what their future would look like. But for the first time, he wasn't trying to control it. He wasn't trying to force it into some predefined mold. Instead, he was willing to let it unfold, slowly, naturally, and to discover what it meant to truly be with someone. Emily, too, was learning to trust again. She had spent so many years surviving, putting up walls to protect herself, to protect her children, that she had forgotten what it meant to let someone in. But with Garrett, something shifted. Not because he was perfect, not because he had all the answers, but because he was finally there, truly present. And in the end, that was the most powerful thing either of them could have asked for.